Hawaii, one of the most popular tourist destinations in the world, owes a good chunk of its thriving tourism industry to none other than the Japanese, who have been obsessed with the Pacific island state for a long time. In 2019, just before the pandemic hit, Hawaii welcomed a staggering 1.5 million Japanese visitors, who spent a total of $2.2 billion on its islands, which is more money spent per capita than any other nationality. And who could blame them? After all, we are talking about the Aloha State here, home to some of the world's most famous beaches, the Diamond Head, hula dancing, and just flat out good vibes all around. Or for the most part. More than half a century ago, during the hopeful years following the Second World War, criminals of all different kinds of ethnic backgrounds rapidly started to flood Hawaii. The Italian-American Mafia, the Chinese Triads, and you know where this is going, the Yakuza. Hawaii, in so many ways, is the ideal playground for criminals. It is a place where people go with one goal and one goal only in mind: to unwind and have fun. It is a place that is synonymous with the word pleasure, and occasionally that pleasure was of the more illegal kind, and crime organizations from both sides of the Pacific were obviously more than happy to start providing such forbidden pleasures to tourists from all over the globe. And so, it was only a matter of time until the land of the rising sun, which was quickly becoming one of the world's biggest exporters, also started exporting its crime syndicates. And similarly to how regular Japanese citizens managed to dominate tourism in Hawaii, the Yakuza at one point seemingly controlled pretty much everything that was fun in Hawaii. So, get you a cold drink and put on some sunglasses and your Aloha shirts as we take a trip to the Pacific island state to explore not only how crime first found its way there and how the Yakuza, among fierce competition, basically ran the whole show for a while, but also how Japan developed a close relationship with Hawaii starting more than 150 years ago. If you end up enjoying this video, don't forget to help your boy out. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and consider supporting me on my Patreon, link below and in the description. But for now, this is the history of Hawaii, Japan, and the Yakuza. Interestingly, Japan and Hawaii were off to an incredibly rocky start, to say the least. While Hawaii has transformed into a paradise for hundreds of thousands of Japanese these days, some of the first Japanese to arrive there were not tourists. In fact, their visit to the Hawaiian Islands couldn't have been further away from a relaxing vacation. Back in the 1860s, Hawaii wasn't yet a part of the US, but in many ways, it certainly felt like it was. American businesses had already established a firm grip on large parts of Hawaii, buying up enormous plots of land and setting up what were mainly fruit and sugar plantations. To get as much profit out of these plantations as possible, cheap labor was required, which was provided by workers that were soon brought in, among other places, from Japan. Dutch-American merchant Eugene Miller Van Reed was the man who made it all possible. In 1866, he departed for Japan and successfully got permission from the shogunate to take with him a group of Japanese citizens who had signed a 3-year contract to go to Hawaii and work on the island's countless plantations. Van Reed, however, came to Japan at a very bad time. Just as he was about to leave, the shogun was officially replaced by Emperor Meiji, rendering the merchant's travel documents invalid. But Van Reed wouldn't have it, and illegally left Japan with around 150 Japanese workers aboard his ship. Among them not only farmers, but also artists, hairdressers, cooks, and allegedly at least one samurai. This group of Japanese immigrants became known as the Gannen-mono, or people of the first year, referring to the first year of the new era of Japan, spearheaded by Emperor Meiji. Now, there might have been plenty of reasons as to why exactly the Gannen-mono agreed to leave their home country to go to Hawaii, but what awaited them there was certainly not what they signed up for. Their salary was much lower than what was agreed, and not only that, but working conditions were also incredibly poor, even by plantation work standards. They were so poor, in fact, that 7 of the Japanese workers had passed away even before their contract ended. Eventually, the new Meiji government of Japan caught wind of what was going on in Hawaii and sent an official to investigate the matter. An agreement with the Kingdom of Hawaii subsequently saw 40 of the ganemono return safely to Japan before the end of their contracts. 54 workers in total went back to Japan after the contracts had ended, but the rest of them either moved to the US or stayed in Hawaii. Those who decided to stay would be only the first of many waves of Japanese citizens who eventually came to work in Hawaii before settling down there permanently. Slowly but surely, the Kingdom of Hawaii, as it was called back then, developed a pretty close relationship with the Japanese Empire under Emperor Meiji. But if the final king of Hawaii, King Kalakaua, had gotten his way, that relationship would have been much, much more meaningful than it ever ended up being. In 1881, during a trip to Japan, Kalakaua proposed an alliance that would have changed the history of Japan, the US, and Hawaii forever. He suggested not only a marriage between his own niece and Prince Higashi Fushimi Yorihito, he also asked Emperor Meiji to enter into an alliance that would basically have made Hawaii a colony of Japan. Emperor Meiji, though, politely declined the offer, and a few years later, the very thing that King Kalakaua was probably trying to prevent ended up happening when the Kingdom of Hawaii became a US territory in 1900. By then, Hawaii had already become home to a fast-growing community of Japanese immigrant workers. While it's important not to forget that working conditions for laborers on the Hawaiian Islands were still unbelievably poor, the Japanese community quickly became the largest foreign ethnic group in Hawaii, which at least provided Japanese workers with a certain sense of togetherness. Now, they were obviously still subordinate to the Americans on the islands, but more and more, they managed to bring their own little Japan over to Hawaii. Buddhist temples could be found on almost every plantation, and starting all the way back in the 1880s, all work stopped on November 3rd of each year to allow the Japanese to celebrate Emperor Meiji's birthday. And as the early 20th century progressed, the Japanese managed to settle down in Hawaii more and more, establishing firm roots and a large community that was ready to stay for generations to come. They even played an important role in forming Hawaii's first multi-ethnic labor union. By 1941, an estimated 158,000 people of Japanese descent lived in Hawaii, making up more than 35% of the island's entire population. Of course, in December of that same year, Hawaii's third largest island, Oahu, became the stage for one of the most significant events in world history. One that, as fate would have it, pitted the US up against the Empire of Japan. The attack on Pearl Harbor. Surprisingly, the Japanese community in Hawaii did not receive as much of a negative reaction to this ruthless attack as one might think. In fact, while around 2% of the Japanese population in Hawaii were taken into custody as a result, the bulk of the discrimination that the Japanese overseas had to suffer following the attack took place on the west coast of mainland US. More than anything, this goes to show just how much influence the Japanese community had in the multicultural environment that was Hawaii. The attack on Pearl Harbor and the subsequent entry into World War II, however, did end up having a negative effect on the Japanese-Hawaiian relationship, at least for a while. From the end of the war in 1945 all the way up to 1963, so for almost 2 decades, the Japanese government blocked its population from traveling abroad for tourism, a decision that was mainly related to the foreign exchange stock, which had not been sufficient to support tourism quite yet. While crime, in one form or another, undoubtedly has had somewhat of a presence there much earlier, it seems like Hawaii got its first taste of organized crime just as the Japanese were finally allowed to go to Hawaii for recreational purposes again. In 1962, a man named George Chung built the foundation for what would later become Hawaii's first true crime syndicate. Before Chung came along, the Hawaiian underworld was more or less divided between an abundance of small, fairly unorganized gangs that all competed against each other in hopes of controlling the shady side of the Aloha State. Shady as in legally questionable, that is. Chinatown gambling rackets, cockfighting, and the prostitution business were all up for grabs, but George Chung sought to create an environment where everyone could go about their illegal business. And so he recruited members of Korean, Chinese, Samoan, Japanese, and native Hawaiian descent. Chung's endeavors were successful, but ultimately short-lived. The late 1960s were an especially violent period. Murders, car bombings, beatings, and kidnappings were a regular occurrence. No one, not even the most powerful men in the Hawaiian underworld, were safe back then. In 1967, George Chung was gunned down in Honolulu's Chinatown, then a Hawaiian hotspot for illegal gambling. Chung's murder, which was never truly solved, created a power vacuum that plunged the island's underworld into even more turmoil than before, as multiple gangsters started competing against each other to replace Chung as the one guy who ran the show. It wasn't until 2 years later, in 1969, that one such guy came along and got a firm grip on the criminal underworld of Hawaii. Wilford Nappy Pulawa, a high-ranking lieutenant of a gang consisting primarily of Samoans, started recruiting members for his own gang starting in 1969. More specifically, he was looking for recruits that were, just like he himself was, of native Hawaiian descent. The nickname Nappy, by the way, either refers to the appearance of his hair or to the fact that he considered himself to be as powerful as Napoleon. No one was ever quite sure which one was true. His gang, which eventually received the name The Company, did pretty much exactly what George Chung and his gang did years earlier, just on a much larger scale. Control over prostitution and gambling, mixed with the extortion of local businesses and the sale of a drug that I will simply call H throughout this video in order to not get demonetized, made Nappy Pulawa an incredibly rich and incredibly influential figure in Hawaii of the early 1970s. Him and the company even got themselves involved in crime on the mainland, mainly Las Vegas. In fact, Pulawa was dangerous and shady enough to land on Nevada's list of excluded persons. The list is more commonly referred to as the Black Book and currently has less than 40 names on it. I wouldn't exactly go as far as calling the inclusion on Nevada's Black Book a respectable achievement, but it goes to show just how feared Pulawa really was in the 70s, even far away from Hawaii. But much like his predecessor, Nappy Pulawa had an intense, but ultimately short-lived career in crime. In 1975, he was sentenced to 24 years in prison for tax evasion after heavily investing in Hawaiian real estate, and following the end of Nappy Pulawa's leadership, the Hawaiian underworld was once more plunged into disarray and infighting. There were guys like Ronald Ching and the amazingly named Henry Hui Hui, which occasionally gained a lot of media coverage and infamy due to their violent actions. But despite that, Pulawa was to be pretty much the last true gang leader that could be seen as a dominant figure in the Hawaiian underworld. With crime in the Aloha State once again divided between countless different factions, it was the perfect time for one of the fastest growing collections of overseas crime syndicates to finally gain a foothold on the islands. The Yakuza were coming to Hawaii. Now, ethnically Japanese gangs and gangsters had been around since the dawn of Hawaiian crime, but the actual Yakuza that came from Japan to Hawaii were an entirely different beast. As Hawaiian law enforcement really started to crack down on organized crime in the 1970s, prosecutor Michael Sterrett, who also helped put away Nappy Pulawa, was hard at work trying to put together Hawaii's first organized crime strike force. Sterrett was as well informed about criminals in America's 50th state as one could possibly be at the time, and yet he didn't know who the Yakuza were and what they were up to until 1976, when he discovered that Hawaii, already infested with local crime and criminal organizations from mainland US, had already been dealing with a third criminal invasion coming from Japan since at least the late 1960s. Yakuza business in Hawaii started on a fairly small scale, focusing mainly on massage parlors, adult bookstores, and the likes. But the Yakuza made big moves at an alarming rate. As early as 1973, they were reportedly working together with New York's Bonanno crime family in the illegal distribution of adult films. Generally, gaining a foothold in Hawaii was shockingly easy for the Yakuza, for several reasons. English language information about the Yakuza was, at best, incredibly difficult to get a hold of for those who did develop an interest, and due to the Yakuza's deep roots in Japanese culture and politics, the Japanese police wasn't very helpful either, supplying US-based law enforcement with only the most basic information and nothing more. With the law in Hawaii and mainland US blissfully unaware of how they operated exactly, the Yakuza had almost free rein to get involved not only in the insanely profitable trade between Asia and America that went through Hawaii, but also the booming local tourism industry, which, as the 70s progressed, was slowly but surely dominated by none other than their fellow Japanese citizens. Overall, Hawaii had become a cozy environment for the Yakuza and their shady activities in many ways, which was only helped by a newfound close relationship to the Pacific State's local criminal underworld. The first big headlines made by the Yakuza in Hawaii came in May of 1976, when a member of the Yakuza was found murdered in his Honolulu apartment. Inada Wataru, nicknamed Jackson, was a member of Tokyo's mighty Sumiyoshi Kai gang, then around 6,000 members strong. He also maintained close ties not only to some of the most prominent criminals in Hawaii, but also to mafiosi on the West Coast. His murder, it was later revealed, was the result of a failed drug deal involving those same mafiosi. James Dooley, author and investigative reporter at the Honolulu Advertiser for nearly 2 decades, first started reporting about the Yakuza in 1978, while covering a murder trial related to the aforementioned Napi Pulava, when a local law enforcement source led him to a man named Takagi Takeshi, a Japanese citizen who lived in one of the fanciest neighborhoods of Honolulu. He was also missing a few finger joints, and was said to have a massive back tattoo. Takagi was clearly a member of the Yakuza, one that was about as cliché as it gets, and he wasn't just part of any gang. Just like Jackson Inada, he was affiliated with the Sumiyoshi Kai. Takagi, and with him the Sumiyoshi Kai, were directly in contact with some of the shadiest people that Hawaii had to offer. During a court appearance in 1978, Takagi was accompanied by 2 men. Wallace S. Furukawa was a former lieutenant and personal driver of Napi Pulava, and in 1970 made headlines when he became the victim of a car bombing that he surprisingly got away from with relatively minor injuries to his legs. Furukawa was also present as a witness during Napi Pulava's massive tax evasion trial, and was later revealed to have been involved in a gigantic illegal bookmaking operation. The second man accompanying Takagi that day was Chan Deems, pretty much the only Caucasian to ever gain any significance in the Hawaiian underworld, and a close business partner of Nakahara Seiji, one of the Sumiyoshi Kai's top men at the time. The Sumiyoshi Kai and all the other Yakuza gangs were drawn to Hawaii for many different reasons, but the main reason was Hawaii's location. As an almost exact midway point between Tokyo and California, it was the perfect spot to do illegal business with their American counterparts. Business that mainly involved smuggling drugs into Hawaii and guns back to Japan. The Japanese also brought with them other goods like adult movies and had a stake in Hawaii's thriving gambling business, a business that the Yakuza themselves had been familiar with for literal centuries at that point. Obviously, the Yakuza were also much better than any other crime organization in Hawaii at supplying its most frequent visitors, the Japanese, who with their booming economy back home had more and more money to spend on vacation, and oftentimes that money went straight into the Yakuza's pockets. Prostitution, for example, proved to be immensely popular with Japanese tourists. For $70, customers were picked up by a chauffeur and brought to one of the Yakuza's numerous brothels. The actual service received there was, of course, included in the price. Some of these establishments were located close to Hawaii's most popular tourist attractions too, like Hotel Tsuru, located just a block away from Waikiki Beach. Access to these Yakuza-run establishments, by the way, was usually reserved for Japanese visitors only. As the years went by, local law enforcement became increasingly aware of the Yakuza's presence in Hawaii. Better late than never, I guess. But to be honest, Japan's crime syndicates were pretty hard to overlook at some point. A trio of Yakuza members made big headlines in the Hawaiian press when they were caught at Honolulu International Airport, each of them carrying 1 pound of the drug I choose to call H stuffed into duty-free cigarette cartons. Their passports later revealed that the 3 men had taken 16 trips to Thailand, where they each probably came from, as well as 12 trips to Hawaii, Guam, and San Francisco. Back in Tokyo, a search of their homes revealed detailed instructions by their superiors on how to transport their precious cargo overseas and how to behave while doing so. Quote, "You should obey whatever you are told to do by your group leader. You have no choice. You cannot refuse or complain about the leader's instructions. The above instructions are given at the request of the financier in order to protect ourselves and to accomplish our work. Therefore, if you want to work and get paid for it, you should follow instructions. The pay schedule is $5,000 for the trip, plus $500 more or less for your pocket money. Your group leader will determine the amount. You must pay for your souvenirs yourself. Your leader will pay for your hotel and 3 meals. He will also pay for your drinks, up to $75. If you have any objections, it means you will be out. You are again advised that you will not get a penny if you fail to obey instructions given by the financier or the middleman." It was also right around this time that US officials and the Drug Enforcement Administration, or DEA, got increasingly worried about the Yakuza after years of more or less ignoring their presence. But now, there were legitimate concerns that the Yakuza would move their business to the west coast of the US next. American law enforcement discovered that the Yakuza had invested vast sums of money into real estate, hotels, and bars there. They were also actively committing crimes in the US, some more disgusting than others. Reportedly, fake scouts were sent to the US, hiring young American girls which were then sent to quote-unquote work in Japan. In reality though, they were forced into prostitution by the Yakuza as soon as they arrived. By the early 80s, reports about a potential criminal invasion of the US coming from Japan started to make big headlines in American newspapers and television programs. Slowly but surely, it became clear that the Japanese crime syndicates had the potential to be a real threat not just at home, but also overseas. Back in Hawaii though, the Yakuza had already become much more than just a threat. With a booming Japanese economy to aid them, they were fast approaching the peak of their power and wealth in the early 80s. They had so much cash, they didn't really know what to do with it. Now, while investments by Japan's shadiest characters could be found in many places back then, New York and California being especially popular targets in the mainland of the US, Hawaii was still the place to spend dirty Yakuza money. A lot of dirty Yakuza money. By the late 80s, Japanese investors had pretty much conquered Hawaii. All but one seafront hotel located in Waikiki reportedly belonged to some wealthy Japanese person, and the Yakuza, or those who had close ties to the Yakuza, could easily compete with their more legitimate counterparts. Take for example Ozano Kenji. Closely associated with the Inagawa Kai gang, Ozano was one of the first Japanese businessmen to see Hawaii's true potential for investment. In the early 70s, he went on a spending spree on the islands, buying 6 hotels including the Sheraton in both Waikiki and Maui, as well as the Princess Kaiulani Hotel. These hotels, according to a detective from Honolulu, frequently offered jobs to new Yakuza arrivals in Hawaii before they went on to take care of gang business. While buying almost half of the most popular hotels in Waikiki, Ozano was accompanied by Ishii Susumu, an up-and-coming gangster and businessman who would later go on to become the second boss of the aforementioned Inagawa Kai, and probably the wealthiest gangster that Japan has ever seen. Yet another big player in Hawaii was Ogawa Kaoru. Ogawa was a so-called sokaya, a corporate blackmailer often closely or directly associated with the Yakuza. The Tokyo Metropolitan Police Department considered him to be, quote, Japan's most influential racketeer, and also claimed that he had collected between $6.8 million and $12 million from up to 1,000 of Japan's largest corporations. Ogawa moved to Hawaii in 1978 and soon became deeply involved in a proxy fight for control over Honolulu's Citibank, and a subsequent lawsuit where he utilized his skills as a sokaya to intimidate Citibank employees into not testifying against him. Reportedly, he was also spotted together with Larry Mehao, an ex-cop slash rancher slash sumo wrestler slash businessman slash political figure who, over the span of 30 years, was accused of being Hawaii's godfather of organized crime on several occasions, yet was never charged with anything despite multiple investigations.
I guess I'm stuck with that. Don't enjoy it. I don't appreciate it. And it's not something you can, take lightly.
And just to name a few more prominent names from the Japanese underworld who were active in Hawaii, Korean Yakuza boss Machi Hisayuki of the Tosei Kai and Taoka Kazuo of the Yamaguchi-gumi were both spotted doing business in Hawaii in the early 80s. Oh, and speaking of the Yamaguchi-gumi, I think this might be the perfect chance to further elaborate on an incident that I quickly touched upon in 2 of my previous videos. In 1985, the DEA managed to catch a few very high-ranking members of the Yamaguchi-gumi red-handed during a huge deal, which saw the gangsters bring in a massive amount of drugs in exchange for an equally massive amount of guns. The weapons were meant to be used against the Ichiwa Kai, which at the time was caught up in a fierce gang war with the Yamaguchi-gumi. Now, the Yakuza thought that they would be striking a deal with the American Mafia here, but instead, they ran straight into a bunch of DEA agents disguised as mafiosi. According to DEA Special Agent Robert Ayu, who was present when the deal took place, Takenaka Masashi, brother of the 4th-generation leader of the Yamaguchi-gumi whose death triggered the aforementioned gang war, picked up one of the rocket launchers during the meeting and suggested that it should be used to kill Yamamoto Hiroshi, the leader of the Ichiwakai. Spoiler alert, Takenaka Masashi's dream never came true. The DEA set the deal up by contacting Sasaka Hiro, a former wrestler and promoter who was to act as an intermediary between the agents and the Yamaguchi-gumi. But unbeknownst to the DEA agents, Sasaki was also in contact with the gang about setting up a potential concert, including none other than the king of pop, Michael Jackson. Sasaki keeping this information from the DEA actually ended up being one of the reasons why the case ultimately failed to bring anyone behind bars. The Yamaguchi-gumi members stated in court that the Michael Jackson thing was the only reason why they had been there in the first place, and that there was a big misunderstanding regarding the Japanese language, saying that in Japanese, "hi" doesn't always mean "I agree." In addition, the DEA's informant Sasaki kept contradicting himself in court, which didn't really help the government's case at all. And just like that, they managed to fumble a case which was preceded by a year-long investigation involving 6 different federal agencies and local police in both Honolulu and Hong Kong. Suspecting entrapment, the jury ultimately found the Yamaguchi-gumi leaders not guilty. Beating such a massive case wasn't the only victory from the Yakuza's point of view. At around the same time, Japanese gangs had managed to become the second biggest collection of crime syndicates in Hawaii, behind only the native Hawaiians. But as time went on, and with the Japanese bubble economy getting closer and closer to its eventual collapse, the Yakuza attempted to move away from the traditional crime model, including drugs and prostitution, focusing more on the business and investment side of things, just like they already did in Japan. Back then, of course, they didn't know just how badly their investments would come crumbling down in just a few years' time. For an example, look no further than Asahi Chuken, one of Japan's largest condominium builders of the late 80s and early 90s, founded and led by Matsumoto Kiso, not long after he decided to leave the Yamaguchi-gumi. By 1991, Asahi Chuken counted around 1,500 employees and a gross income of $1.5 billion. With numbers like that, overseas expansion was pretty much inevitable, and after already successfully moving into Thailand, Matsumoto set his sights on Hawaii, purchasing an entire block in downtown Honolulu for $100 million, as well as the Turtle Bay Hilton Hotel and a country club on the island of Oahu. Matsumoto was prepared to pour another $1 billion into Hawaiian development projects when his 2 brothers, also closely affiliated with the Yamaguchi-gumi, were found violating visa charges, which ended up shifting attention to Kiso himself. Soon, he was forced to return to Japan, just as the country's economic bubble burst. His company was soon $4.5 billion in debt, and his business empire had crumbled. The economic impact of the Japanese bubble burst reached far beyond the borders of Japan itself, though. With a lack of disposable income, travel also became less and less affordable for the Japanese throughout the 90s, which meant that their favorite travel destination Hawaii also had to suffer. Tourism obviously took a bit of a nosedive, and so did business in general. With that, legitimate Japanese, but also Yakuza and Yakuza-affiliated businesses failed, one after another. For a short moment, it seemed like the negative side of the plummeting numbers of Japanese visitors would also come with a positive side, finally giving the Yakuza a reason to pull out of Hawaii to once again focus on crimes and investments back home. But in the long run, the Yakuza were undeterred by Japan's financial hardships, at least when it came to maintaining a presence in Hawaii. The Yakuza's grip on the Hawaiian business and criminal landscape is now a far cry from what it was during the 70s and 80s especially. But make no mistake, the Yakuza are still present in the Aloha State, even if their activities are much less visible and newsworthy than they once were. It seems like crime in America's 50th state has more or less gone back to what it was like during the 1950s, hosting a diverse mix of organized crime groups of all different kinds of nationalities and ethnicities, including the Japanese. Ironically, this perfectly mirrors Hawaii itself in many ways. After all, Hawaii is about as ethnically diverse as you can get, a place where everyone is welcome, but where at the same time one group is never truly dominant over the others. As weird as it may sound, with so many different crime syndicates able to coexist in Hawaii, it almost seems like the Aloha spirit exists even in something as negative and parasitic as the island state's criminal underworld. Have you ever been to Hawaii? Are you from Hawaii? Have you ever had any experiences with crime over there yourself? Let us know in the comments. A special shout out again goes out to all my Patreon supporters listed here, including Busner, Bobby Wu, Javier Soravia, Capybara Chuck, Turam, Daniel Dees, Raman Kalis, White Gilden, Justin Down, Yoko the Space Whale, Steve Matsui, and Tori and Gales. And to everyone who watched all the way until the end, thank you so much for watching. Sayonara.